Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Strauss. I teach Jewish studies here at American University, and I'm affiliated faculty also with the Center for Israel Studies. And I direct the undergraduate program for Jewish Studies at AU. Welcome to the second webinar in our fall 2024 series, which we've called Anti-Semitism, a Political Tradition. And it consists of 6 talks highlighting the work and perspectives of our own faculty and alumni. Of course, this topic, which has long been important to the Jewish community, has moved to the front of our collective conscience since the events of October 7th, 2023, exactly a year ago, as we have seen that horrendous day serve not as an end, but the beginning of a terrifying new chapter of anti-Semitism around the globe. This series is co-sponsored by AU's Jewish Studies program and the Meltzer-Schwartzberg Center for Israel Studies at American. As always, the faculty of both programs thanks the Center for Israel Studies Managing Director, Laura Cutler, for ably navigating so many logistics for our programs. We also thank Eric Gordon, our technical whiz, who you will hear more about. We also want to extend a warm welcome to our international audience, which includes friends of the university and of both the Jewish Studies program and the Meltzer-Schwartzberg Center for Israel Studies, as well as AU alumni, academic colleagues from many other institutions, and of course, our own students. Now it is a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker. American University professor Pamela Nadell has been a foundational member of the history faculty and of AU's Jewish Studies program for many years, and has been director of the Jewish Studies program for much of that time. She is the author of, among other texts, the award-winning book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, which won the National Jewish Book Award Book of the Year in 2019. Her next book is entitled Antisemitism and American Tradition, a History, and it will be published in September of 2025. With chagrin, she notes that she is now probably best known for being the 4th witness in last December's congressional hearing, shall I say infamous congressional hearing, with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and UPenn, or I should say the then presidents of Harvard and UPenn. But I'll add, Pam, that you definitely fared the best in the end. Professor Nadell, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to hearing your insights on this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate your moderating this series, helping us organize this series, and helping us continue our invaluable mission of educating our communities about the history of anti-Semitism. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's make sure that worked. And since I'm not getting any messages that it didn't, I'm going to speak in different ways today. As a professor, I have spent my entire academic career doing research and scholarship, and as a scholar, I have always tried to strive for scholarly objectivity. But today is October 7th, 1 year since the horrific attack on Israel, when some 1,200 people, Israeli Jews, Israeli Muslims, more than 70 foreign nationals, 40 of them Americans, were murdered, and more than 250 people were taken hostage. And this attack, I need to speak personally, as I think everyone who has been affected is today. This attack has been widely compared to the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But for those of us who are historians, this attack does not echo in the same way what the Nazis did by jamming Jews into gas chambers or shooting them into pits in their rush to murder millions as quickly as they could. This attack was a pogrom committed by Jews' neighbors. And the savage brutality of the attack and what happened that day has deeply, deeply scarred Jewish people everywhere. As the Brandeis University historian S. Elon Troen wrote, showing, let me get this photograph. Oh, wait. No, let's see. There. All right. So these are, this is not his photo. Let me just tell you, these are posters of Israeli hostages taken that day, and they are displayed in the office of Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. But Elon Troen, who I know, wrote an article in CNN.com, and he gave CNN.com this image. And the title of his article, which is just so powerful, is "My Grandmother Was Killed in a Pogrom, Then My Daughter Was Too." So for many, many people, many denounced the horrors of that day, the murders, the torture, the rape, the pillage, the burnings, and much of it filmed by the terrorists, who boasted not how many Israelis they had killed, but how many Jews they had killed. But what proved shocking to Jews and our allies here in the US and around the world was that the massacre blew off the covers over the sewers of anti-Semitism, snaking the globe. This happened on city streets, and as we all know, most shockingly, it happened to many of us on college campuses. Do note the date of this. This is from 2023, from before October 7th. But to give one of the best known examples, which is why I chose this image, the day of the massacre, 33 student organizations at Harvard University signed on to a statement written by Harvard undergraduate Palestine Solidarity Committee. And it said Israel was, and I quote, "the only one to blame," close quote, for the attack. On October 7th, I reached out to colleagues and friends in Israel to see how they were. In return, they immediately reached out to me to see how I was on my campus. I was, and I am, as much as any Jew can be in these days of rage against the Jewish people. I am okay. I am proud that American University's board and leadership stepped up as anti-Semitism, masked as anti-Zionism, was voiced on this campus, and it responded with policies essential to fulfilling our mission as educators. Those policies included banning encampments on our campus. This is a photo of UCLA, not of American University. Yet, today, as Jews light candles around the world to remember the murdered, to memorialize their lives that were cut short, their names, and clamor to bring home the few hostages who are still alive, I want to reflect on what I heard in the days and weeks after October 7th. Over and over, people said to me, "I never thought I would live to see this in my lifetime." But as a historian of the American Jewish experience, who has spent the past half decade researching and writing my forthcoming book, Anti-Semitism and American Tradition, I wasn't surprised. The neo-Nazis and white nationalists who chanted "Jews will not replace us" as they paraded across the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in August 2017, and the murder of 11 Jews at prayer at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh a year later had propelled me to begin teaching a first-year seminar on anti-Semitism and to turn to researching this book. And I just want to point out that this prayer book from the Tree of Life Synagogue, what you see at the top is how it was sheared by a bullet. And this is a photo of when it was displayed in the Russell Senate Office Building, Rotunda, at the US Capitol last June. So, digging into the history for this book, reckoning with this hate in my personal life, knowing at least 5 people who lost loved ones that day or in the tunnels in Gaza, that is what compelled me to depart in these opening remarks from scholarly objectivity. As a professor of Jewish history, I know I have taught the Jewish past from antiquity to the present. And that has taught me that October 7th, 2023 will join a litany of catastrophes that Jews have commemorated across the millennia. The destruction of both temples in Jerusalem, the first in 586 BCE, the second in the year 70 of the Common Era. The First Crusade, the massacres of the First Crusade in 1096, which my students literally were talking about in class this morning. The Khmelnytsky massacres, the Khmelnytsky pogroms of 1648 in Poland and Ukraine. The Kishinev pogrom of 1903. And Kristallnacht, Germany's massive 1938 pogrom against the Jewish people in that November in 1938, known as the Night of Broken Glass. So I will stop speaking personally, and I'm going to return to my customary position as a historian. The examples that I just gave, some of them from the ancient past, some from the 20th century, occurred far away from America's golden shores. America, so American Jews have always assumed, is different, was different. Jews believe that America has always welcomed them. When anti-Semitic rage erupted on October 7th, they were surprised. But I wasn't, because I've been watching the rise of anti-Semitism in the examples I just gave you. By November of 2017, I had already been called to testify in Congress on rising anti-Semitism. In April of 2023, American University's Jewish Studies program decided, actually published at that point, decided to do it earlier, published this guide, Understanding Antisemitism, a guide for the AU community. That's indicative of the fact that we recognized already that we needed to do a better job of explaining this history. I'm its lead author, but my colleagues, including Lauren Strauss, who's on here, my colleagues, my students, some of them my own, some of them from other classes who found me, helped and shaped what we wrote. And I also want to emphasize that I was asked to do this by Fanta Aw, who was then AU's vice president for campus life. As a leader of the American University administration, she and others recognized that we had to do a better job of explaining anti-Semitism as an important component of educating our students. So before I discuss some of the highlights of this guide, as I promised to do in the title, I want to follow up on the tour de force opening to our series that my esteemed colleague, distinguished Professor Michael Brenner, presented last week. He started here, what is anti-Semitism, with the question of a hyphen. And then he talked about the problem of defining the term. He took us all the way back to the plan to murder all the Jews in the biblical book of Esther. He touched on the conspiracy theories of Christian anti-Judaism and emphasized the power of anti-Semitic images. Turning to the rise of modern racial anti-Semitism, he talked about how it had appeared in Germany in the late 19th century. He looked at Hitler's attempt to overthrow the constitutional Weimar Republic in Munich in November of 1923, and in his failed beer hall putsch. And we will actually hear more about that topic from next week's presenter, our Holocaust Studies postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Julie Korestes, who is going to talk more about that and about Hitler's photographer. But Professor Brenner also reminded us that just a decade after that failed beer hall putsch, Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. Quickly, he would become the Fuhrer of the Third Reich. And from there, he would launch his war against the Jews and the Holocaust. But as you know, I am a historian of the American Jewish experience. So I want to add some chapters to that history, but from the American side, from the American perspective. What we always talk about in terms of American Jewish history is we had actually, as his scholars, I think it really minimized the history of American anti-Semitism. Honestly, the last really good book on the subject was written in 1994, which is a long time ago. And we did that because, to be honest, anti-Semitism in America never took that kind of murderous turn that we saw in the pogroms of Eastern Europe or in the Holocaust. But that's no reason to ignore the chapters that happened. As I discussed in a recent article in the online journal Sub-Peer, which you can read online, you can also subscribe to get a free issues, I think 4 times a year. This just appeared a month or so ago. The America, which Jews like to call the Golden Medina, the Golden Land, it's never been free of anti-Semitism. The problem is that we either so idealized this history of American Jews or knew so little about it that most people looking at what happened on October 7th saw a rupture, whereas I saw a continuity with the past. So one way of reading American Jewish history has been to highlight that America's Jews created the most thriving, remarkable diaspora Jewish community in all of Jewish history. I don't disagree with that. But another way of reading American Jewish history is to recognize that that remarkable diaspora community has never been free from experiencing Jew hatred. So let me show you a couple of examples. In 1654, in September 1654, 23 Jews fleeing persecution in Brazil, which had been recently reconquered by the Portuguese, decided to go to New Amsterdam. You'll know it better as New York, but it's not New York until 1664. And when they got there, its governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wrote, when you can see the quote here, he wrote a letter saying he wanted to expel the Jews. And why? Because they were hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. By the way, he also called them usurers. So the letter goes on. I didn't put everything right here in this quotation, but he was using classic Christian anti-Judaism as a way to get rid of the Jews. As you know, he wasn't successful, and that's how Jews ended up living in New York when it became New York, and the largest Jewish community in America has remained the New York Jewish community for a very, very long time. 200 years later, General Ulysses S. Grant, convinced that Jewish speculators in the cotton trade were undermining his military campaign during the Civil War, issued this order of expulsion, expelling the Jews from his entire military district, which actually ran from the southern tip of Illinois all the way down to just about New Orleans. And he gave them 24 hours to get out. The fact that only about 100 Jews were affected could lead someone to say, okay, well, this is a minimal event. It echoed the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, but it was nothing like that. Yet the notion that how do you deal with the problem of the Jews you expel them just the way the Spanish did. It raised an echo of this kind of anti-Semitism on American soil. Right after the Civil War, Joseph Seligman was a Bavarian-born immigrant who had started out as a peddler and had created an international banking business and international influence, and was so important and actually such a good friend of President Ulysses S. Grant that Grant offered him to be Secretary of the Treasury, and Seligman declined. But in 1877, 12 years after the end of the Civil War, when Seligman went to stay in Saratoga Springs, New York, at the Grand Union Hotel, he was told that he could no longer be admitted. He'd actually stayed there for previous summers because the hotel had adopted a new policy, a no Israelites policy. Emma Lazarus, maybe some of you know the name, she's a poet. She wrote the poem inscribed in the base of the Statue of Liberty, the New Colossus. It welcomes the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to America. And she was so outraged by what had happened that a few years later, she wrote an essay on the Jewish problem in the mainstream magazine Century to teach the readers of that magazine, who were by and large not Jews, but American middle class and intellectual readers, to teach them about the long history of anti-Semitism, including this example. Even before America entered World War I, this anti-Semitic incident happened. Leo Frank was a manager at a pencil factory in Atlanta. He was accused of having murdered his employee, Mary Fagan. He was convicted. He was sentenced to die. When the governor commuted the sentence, he was actually taken from his jail by a gang, and he was lynched. And in these years, immediately following this and after World War I, anti-Semitism in America took new forms of prejudice and discrimination against Jews. If you can see in this headline, like the fifth column over towards your right, where it says Lowell tells Jews limited colleges might help them. By the way, this is the front page of the New York Times. Restrictive quotas began to emerge on the admission of Jewish students to colleges and universities. Ultimately, 700 colleges and universities set quotas on the numbers of Jews they would admit. New immigration legislation in 1921 and 1924 barred poor Polish Jews from coming to America. And prejudice in these years became so pervasive that Jewish Americans were limited about where they could live, vacation, work, and be educated, that historians have long called these years the high tide of American anti-Semitism. After World War II, a writer named Laura Z. Hobson published a novel about a journalist who pretends to be Jewish to expose those restrictions. The fact that she's writing that then shows that they had not disappeared immediately after World War II, the discrimination, and eventually it became an Academy Award-winning film, Gentleman's Agreement. And after that time, more like in the 50s, more like in the 60s, thanks in part to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the discriminations that Jews had faced in the United States began to fall. So some began to talk about a golden age of acceptance for American Jews. But it was this assumption that American Jews had long lived a golden age of acceptance that led to writing the AU Guide. So let me tell you just briefly its origin story. I didn't have the idea for the guide. It actually came from my colleague, Kirsten Vermeglish, a professor at Michigan State University. And in the summer of 2022, I had had a conversation with her where she told me how she and her colleagues at Michigan State had spent more than a year developing a guide to understand anti-Semitism for their community. So, thanks to Zoom, in the fall of 2022, when I was teaching um, my first year seminar on anti Semitism, I invited her to come to class. And also that day, a number of university administrators joined us. And as a result, I was asked to develop a guide, and I very much want to acknowledge the guide developed at Michigan State University because they gave me permission not only to quote periodically from it, but honestly to model ours on what they had done so that we did not have to spend an entire year. And by that April, we were able to publish it. So I do want to emphasize this is a guide. It is not a policy statement. It is nothing that has been officially adopted. I don't believe it should be officially adopted, but it's only 15 pages. You can link to it from the Jewish Studies homepage. It's meant to help members of our community understand anti Semitic motifs, to recognize them when they are voiced today, and and as I would hope, to respond appropriately by denouncing them, just as in the university, we denounce all forms of hatred and prejudice. So I want, in the time that I have left before we turn to questions, I want to take you through some of the components of the guide. As Professor Brenner pointed out last week, defining anti-Semitism is deeply problematic. There are multiple competing definitions that scholars have developed. And honestly, my favorite definition, which is attributed to the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, is an anti Semite is someone who hates Jews more than absolutely necessary. But we did feel that we needed to provide some language in the guide. And so we have this very short kind of bullet point definition. Anti-Semitism is rhetoric, discrimination, prejudice, promotion of conspiracy theories, hostility, and or violence against Jews and Jewish people. So then, because I've had so many students over the years who have never met a Jew before coming to American University, we have just a few paragraphs introducing Jews and Judaism. And then we turn to the heart of the guide. So we focus on its major themes, some of which Professor Brenner talked about last week. We need to understand Christian anti-Judaism. We need to understand its long millennial-old charge of Jews killing Christian children to use their blood for religious purposes. We need to understand some of the calumnies that are bandied about how Jews are corrupted by money. We certainly need to understand, as Professor Brenner pointed out last week, using this slide, that Jews are often depicted as physically deviant, or in this case, depicted as devils. But I want to show you, and this is from the guide, that in America, they also became highly racialized as distinctively different. So this is a postcard published in 1901 by a German immigrant named Franz Huld. I don't know much about him. I tried to find more, but I know he was an immigrant. And on the bottom of it, or on the side of it actually, it apparently was sent to someone in Germany. And the person who wrote it, presumably a German immigrant because he wrote in German, said, "Here I send you the view of my fellow countrymen." And every image that we see here is disparaging and highly racialized. So the maker of the whoever drew the graphic, he racializes Polish Jews, the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, African Americans. He uses a vile racial slur about them, and also indigenous peoples. The point of this photograph, or this postcard, which by the way comes from a massive collection by Arthur Langerman, who has collected anti-Semitic memorabilia. His collection runs to the thousands. This was actually displayed at the United Nations about a year or so ago in a collection of these kinds of graphic depictions that already America had a very wide embrace of these anti-Semitic racial ideologies, and well before Madison Grant publishes his passing of the Great Race. But the point is that already ideas about the white race in being endangered were already also out there. They just hadn't been articulated by the man who's the best known articulator of that, the best known author of that book. And so what you can see in this image, and this one comes from a magazine, a satirical magazine called Judge. So if you look really closely, you see this is New York. The Jewish immigrants, and it's clear that they're Jews. It's clear by the beards, the noses, by the fact that they've renamed New York, New Jerusalem. They've taken over New York. All the signs are Aaron Levy or Moses Lazarus. And who's fleeing? The people who are fleeing are the Knickerbockers and the founders, essentially the founders of America, and they're heading west. So these ideas about the way in which immigrants, in this case in particular Jewish immigrants, endangered the true Americans were already widely known by the end of the 19th century. By the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world were already rising in America. In the early 1920s, Henry Ford, who was, probably the best known figure of his day, who actually contemplated a run for the presidency, he launched a series called The International Jew, The World's Problem. It ran in this newspaper that he owned, the Dearborn Independent, for 91 weeks. And here he republished parts of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most notorious anti-Semitic tract ever written. Meanwhile, if you traveled around America in some of those Ford motor cars, you could find signs like this: Christians only, Jews not allowed, Gentiles only, dotting the landscape. Then the guide turns to anti-Semitism in Israel, certainly the issue that is most on our minds since October 7th. Even before the United Nations established the State of Israel, voted to partition, actually, British Mandate Palestine in November 1947 into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, Zionism and Zionists were under attack. The columns in Ford's newspaper that I just showed you considered Zionism another form of communism. The Soviets had long had a campaign against Zionism, which was unquestionably a way of masking Soviet anti-Semitism. You could attack Zionists, but they denounced anti-Semitism, in other words, attacks on Jews. By the time the 1967 Six-Day War broke out, some groups on the American left, among them the civil rights organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, were already vilifying Zionism, Zionists, Israel, and their American Jewish advocates. So I don't have enough time to go into this history in today's talk, but I do want to emphasize that in talking about Israel and Zionism, the guide makes two critical points. The first is that 85% of world's Jews today live in Israel and the United States. The second is that for the great majority of American Jews, caring about Israel and its people forms a powerful part of their Jewish identities. So the guide recognizes, citing a report published by a working group of the Association for Jewish Studies. This organization, I was actually a past president of it. This is the learned society of Jewish scholars around the world. Those of us who are teaching Jewish studies here at American University, but at universities across the United States and elsewhere. This is the organization where we meet and where we share our scholarship. And this guide upholds academic freedom, recognizes that criticism of Israel is not equivalent to anti-Semitism, but it continues. If one's position on Zionism or Israeli policies, or if one's position on Palestinian movements serves as a proxy for invoking hateful symbols and tropes, whether anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, or otherwise bigoted, or acts as a litmus test for inclusion in activities or clubs, then the protections of academic freedom no longer stand. It's those symbols and tropes drawn from classic anti-Semitism that cross the line to hate speech. So I like to think of this in another way. So here's from that hearing with the presidents, the university presidents, or as Lawrence Strauss said, two of them were then university presidents from Congress from last year. And I want to quote Sally Kornbluth, not only because she kept her job, but also because she said something that I consider really powerful. And I think it's a message that we should all be able to take. She said, I strongly believe that there is a difference between what we can say to others, to one another, and what we have a right to say. In other words, the Supreme Court permits hate speech. It permits anti-Semitic hate speech. We could talk about the cases allowing this, but then what we should say as a member of our community. This evening, AU's new president, Jonathan Alger, is convening a unity dinner on our campus, and I know that this is a message that he and so many of us are trying to foster. We may have a constitutional right to hate speech, but if we live in a community, it doesn't mean that we should say it. So to return very quickly to the guide before we take questions, it provides examples of anti-Semitism around Israel that have manifested themselves on campus before October 7th, 2023, because we wrote this and published it in April of 2023. You can read these in detail if you click on the website, but it's about denouncing Israel as a litmus test to participate in university life is anti-Semitic. Holding all Jews accountable for Israeli policies is anti-Semitic. Using anti-Semitic myths and symbols to criticize Israel, denying the history of Jews and Jewish sovereignty in ancient Israel, calling for the destruction of Israel. So I'm going to stop my slides and make a few closing remarks. So where does it leave us? On the one hand, we could update the guide many, many times over with examples since October 7th. I'm not going to do that. I think actually having examples from before is really, really powerful. And some of you may have been reading about task forces on anti-Semitism, showing how pervasive anti-Semitism is on campuses. The one from Stanford University is called It's in the Air. And it was in the air not just since October 7th. But I want on what I see today as a dividing day in the Jewish experience to close with a different reflection. About 10 days ago, I heard Representative Jamie Raskin speak at Six and I, an event space and a synagogue in Washington. It was in a conversation co-sponsored by the Tree of Life group that is in the process of rebuilding that synagogue and also trying to do some of the kind of work that we are doing here about educating about anti-Semitism. And it's appropriate to quote him because he used to be my colleague when he taught constitutional law here at American University. He said, anti-Semitism is the gateway to the destruction of liberal democracy. And I think of how Professor Brenner pointed last week to the 10 years between the failed Munich beer hall putsch and Hitler becoming chancellor. For me, this is an essential lesson for our moment. It's why we developed the guide on anti-Semitism for our community, because as I think about what we must teach our students, who are, after all, the future leaders of our country, I am more convinced than ever that we must educate about the perniciousness of anti-Semitism. I join colleagues and allies at AU, across the United States, and around the globe in pledging to do my part to promote this education. And I'll now take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam, so much. Like I said last week, after Professor Brenner, each of these talks just is the tip of the iceberg, and really is a reflection of the amount of scholarship, the wealth of scholarship, really that these experts are coming to this topic with. So it's impossible to go deeply into every example, which is why I would encourage you who are watching it live to really go back and listen again and look up each of these manifold examples that Dr. Nadell has given us of anti-Semitism, especially in the American context. So we have a bunch of comments and questions already. Some of them are similar to each other, so I'll conflate those. But one sort of logistical note, someone asked us, and thank you for the reminder, to post the guide that Dr. Nadell referred to, the guide to anti-Semitism at American University. And so Eric Gordon did do that, and he posted in the chat the link to the guide that that Pam mentioned. So please do go and look that up there. So the first question really is about college campuses in general then. Why do you think that anti-Semitism, and we'll deal separately in a couple of future questions about anti-Zionism and what the difference is, but anti-Semitism overall, why do you think it has manifested itself so widely on college campuses in particular?
I think it's actually been brewing for a couple of decades, and I think this is the issue why I wasn't so surprised by what happened, but why other people were. And of course, um, uh, Dr. Strauss actually knows quite a bit about this also from experiences that her own family had, and that anti-Semitism has, by the early 2000s, it's either 2001, 2002, college and university presidents were already signing on to an ad published in the New York Times saying that Jewish students on their campuses were facing anti-Semitism. And it was anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism, but it was unquestionably anti-Semitism. And so it's been brewing for over 2 decades. Actually starts at the University of California at Berkeley in the 1990s. And there was a concerted campaign. And I think we actually don't quite understand everything that happened to make it possible. But it has really been quite clear to me that there's been a movement. It started in Britain, comes to the United States, and it's designed to essentially attack any kind of supporter of the state of Israel. And so to do that, that means it's attacking American Jews, since, as we know, over 80% of American Jews consider Israel either an essential or an important part of their Jewish identity.
So that is a great segue to a number of questions from viewers about the link. They would like to hear you say a little bit more, clarifying a little bit more why you seem to be conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and whether there is any criticism of Israel in general and specifically of the current Israeli government and Netanyahu that is either legitimate is a funny word, but that is not specifically anti-Semitic. Just more clarification.
So the first thing that I would remind everyone is, before October 7th, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were protesting every single week in the streets of the cities all over the country against the government. Protesting a government, just as has happened in the United States when people protested during the Vietnam War, that is the right of citizens of a democratic nation. The issue is that the word Zionist has become weaponized as a way to say, I'm not, and I believe me, I've been in conversations where this happens, where someone says, I abhor anti-Semitism, but I oppose Zionism. And the opposition to Zionism is generally then added as opposition to the legitimacy of the existence of a Jewish state. And to say that Jews have no right to national self-determination, a right that is guaranteed under international law, is a way of, it's what the Soviets did. It's a way of getting around the issue. And it becomes to oppose the Netanyahu government, to oppose policies which Israelis are also protesting about the war, that is not anti-Semitic. There's no question about that. However, to oppose the right of the state to defend itself, to oppose the right of the state to exist, to call for cleansing Israel of Jews from the river to the sea, these are clearly crossing the line. I'm reminded of a very powerful column that New York Times columnist Bret Stephens wrote this week, where he basically said, let's just stop arguing about this. Zionism, the word Zionist, has become weaponized. It is now used, often Zion Nazi, we see that. And I don't know if you noticed, but at New York University, in their new student code of conduct, they have written rules about when the word Zionist crosses the line to hate speech.
Thank you. There's some back and forth, and I'll remind people who are watching and listening that Q&A isn't C&A. It's not comments and answers. It's questions and answers.
I'm not reading it.
So that's why I'm reading for you. There's a little bit of a back and forth going on. Sorry that if you would like to have a conversation, I'm sure there are other times for this. But really questions that are informational are really welcome. But some of those questions that are challenging is have to do, and I'm digging a little deeper because this is the kind of overwhelming theme that we're getting, and then there are some others that we'll pick up with. Digging a little deeper into this question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so first of all, sort of on two fronts, some of the writers of these comments / questions identify as Jews and say as a Jew IX, and say, are you saying that if I am anti-Zionist, I'm an anti-Semite, and is that possible? And also, not aside from the people who are criticizing specific policies of the Netanyahu government, would you say, or ask these questions, would you say that anyone who denies the right of Israel to exist as it was construed and as it came to be 100 years ago, that people who challenge that right, for whatever reason, details of important details of Israel's history, that anyone who challenges that legitimacy is an anti-Semite?
So I'll take the second one first. Historians have lots of different ways at looking at the past. And there's no question that there was a revisionist school of Israeli historiography that talked about the grand narrative sort of crafted in Leon Uris's Exodus that was very critical of that it left lots of things out. So I'm not saying that that the narrative of Israel's birth has always been depicted properly. but, and remind me of the first one again? I lost track, sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. If somebody who's Jewish,
Oh yeah,
heard
somebody
these
who's Jewish,
views.
right. So the issue, and we know this, I mean, there's an organization called Jewish Voices for Peace, and I believe some of its members don't think that Israel should exist as an independent state. The issue is that we have a very difficult situation. There's no question about it. We have two peoples who both claim legitimacy to control of a particular piece of land, and they've been unable to figure out how to coexist. And it's been, multiple wars, the terrible war in Gaza, terrible loss of life, and but foundationally, there is a, a that for Jews to deny Israel the right to exist, to say that the decision taken at the United Nations to create a Jewish state and an independent Arab state, to say that these international decisions are wrong and should be reversed, leaves us with a massive problem and the potential for genocide. And and genocide, by the way, a word coined not until 1944 to describe the mass murder of all of European Jewry, or the intended mass murder of all of European Jewry, 6 million. And I understand the argument. I understand the pushback. How dare I conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? But the reality is that anti-Zionism so often is cloaked in anti-Semitic tropes. The blood-eating, this was done for the dean of the law school, where they portrayed him as, when he invited students to dinner, this is at University of Berkeley, invited students to dinner, and students put up a poster, which he let stay in the law school because of freedom of expression, where they showed him with a bloody knife and fork. And it's the incorporation of those anti-Semitic motifs is the first problem. But the second problem, and the larger problem, is absolutely the denying of any kind of legitimacy to the Jewish claims. And so I do believe that it crosses the line, it's so blurred that it's impossible to separate them out. And I will say, if you like to think about this more deeply, there was a guide put out by a group called the Nexus Group. It's a lot of our colleagues, and they have actually taken a number of the different tropes and the different ways of expressing anti-Zionism, and they have parsed out when it is anti-Semitic based on intent and when it is not anti-Semitic based on intent. And so you can talk about this, and you can certainly have conversations about it. The question is, when do you examine the intent? So when somebody says X, but they're not using an anti-Semitic trope, then maybe it's not specifically anti-Semitic. But honestly, in the moment, who's got time to parse out intent?
So thank you. So we have a few great questions that are flooding in all of a sudden. This always happens. I will take the great question from my student, Elijah, who asks, how do we ensure that the people that most need to learn about anti-Semitism do so? I worry that people that need to will never read a pamphlet about anti-Semitism.
Right. So first of all, great to have a question from Elijah. Great to have a question from students. The many schools are beginning to require anti-Semitism education as part of their orientation for their first year students. It's my hope that we will do this at American University. We did some kinds of adding some components on understanding anti-Semitism in our foundational core course, but that course is being completely revised, and it's my hope that we will have more about that. But Elijah, you're right. The problem is there's so much to learn, and that this is about a tiny percentage of the American population. Jews are about 2.5% of the population of the United States. Of course, they are more than 50% of the victims of religiously based hate crimes, according to the FBI. So I do think this is important. And let me add, Now, I was not the only one who was thinking about how to develop a guide about anti-Semitism. In May of 2023, the White House issued a document on combating anti-Semitism.
That's right. So, clearly, as you said before, it's in the air. Maybe that in a good way. A sort of informational point of information. Someone would like to know, in which issue of Judge was the image you displayed published?
I actually, unfortunately, I don't know.
Mm.
It's in a collection at the American Jewish Historical Society, and I've asked them for the source, and they don't have it. So I apologize for that. But it's in an archival collection.
I guess you could go back. I don't know when or where Judge
I don't know if we
and
can
look at
find them.
every.
I mean, I've tried, but they told me that they have a collection of anti-Semitic imagery, and that's
So we have two really great questions that could be lectures in themselves. And one of them, I have to say, is from one of our upcoming lecturers, Natalie Japkowitz. And these both contextualize or ask you to contextualize anti-Semitism in a larger framework. And one from Isabel Hedrick asks, can you please address commonalities and continuities between American forms of anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred or violence in America? Racism, Islamophobia, sexism, homophobia, etc. And Natalie's question is putting it in a different, larger context. To what extent is domestic anti-Semitism today purely domestic, and to what extent does it come from foreign sources? And is there a concerted effort to address it in that sort of larger framework of world anti-Semitism? So those are, larger context domestically with other issues, and larger context internationally with anti-Semitism.
so. In response to the first question, what really jumps out at me is that we know a great deal, obviously, about the horrific racism that African Americans faced in the people of color faced in the United States, both when they were forcibly enslaved and after the period of enslavement, when the formerly enslaved were then subjected to Jim Crow legislation. We have tremendous amount of history that's been written about this, and others have written about the expulsions of Chinese from the West Coast, and what indigenous peoples have faced in the United States. What I do in my own work is actually to situate anti-Semitism. The title of the book is Anti-Semitism in American Tradition, because I'm situating it alongside those other forms of American prejudice. And I think that's an important point. As to Professor Japkowitz's question, the problem is I don't know, and I'm not sure who does, to what extent anti-Semitism from around the world has, the way in which it has deliberately infiltrated into the United States. I've got hints of that I found in various places from the research I was doing. Certainly, we know that the 2001 Conference Against Racism and other things that the United Nations sponsored in Durban, South Africa in September of 2001, that anti-Semitism was just so wildly erupted there, that both Israel and the United States pulled out their delegations. So, and the anti and at Durban, the non-governmental organizations called for an international boycott against Israel, but they did it in anti-Semitic terms. So I think that there's definitely a connection. We are a global world, we're global society, global economy, but I don't have the hard data on that.
There's always more to say. Unbelievably, we are at the end of the hour, 1 minute over. And there are a few other comments rolling in. One of those, though, the only one I'll address, asks Pam how to contact you. And we are all easily findable on the AU website, and you can find our email addresses. And so this is only a beginning. It's not an end. It's really a conversation. It's a process of education. And with now 1/3 of our series, 2 of our six lectures out there. I hope that the process of education is really just beginning. Thank you again so much to Professor Nadell. Thank you all to joining us on what is a day full of a lot of heavy conversations and subjects. And I will see you next week when we hear from our colleague, our postdoc, as Pam mentioned, Julie Koreshtis, who will speak about the case of Hitler's photographer, which is really fascinating based on her recent research. So thank you again, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks so much.